here on time. I'm sure traffic will be fun. Okay, so the next piece that I'm going to go through, the next bullet is a little bit comprehensive because we're going to walk through, what's included when we talk about an investigation, what's included in that, and there are a number of different components. And in particular, what we're really interested in is the data and information that's collected that ultimately forms the basis of the evidence. And again, I'm going to say this over and over, this is all very scalable, again, depending on your needs and depending on the incident and what's involved. But really the primary objective of collecting this information or evidence is to help you identify and verify responsible parties, assessing and assigning damages, especially if there's, kind of cost recovery or for the purposes of future enforcement. And then again, making sure that the right enforcement action is brought forward. And if it's something that escalates into, something you pursue more as a case or with the district attorney, you really want to make sure that you've got what you need to have a legally defensible case. And you don't always know what something will turn into. So making sure that no matter what type or what size of incident you go out to, making sure that you use the same principles and fundamentals when you're collecting this information will be helpful because, again, you might have something that you respond to and then you're back there in a year, back there in 2 years, and all of a sudden now you've got an issue where you've got some chronic discharger, and you're going to want all of that information to be legally defensible and form the basis of your evidence for something that you pursue later. So again, because you don't know, you want to follow the same types of principles, and kind of when we talk about evidence, what is evidence, and we'll talk about different types, such as we're going to walk through kind of what we call informal interviews or conversations that you have with folks, photographs, samples, reports that you might write. All those things can form the basis of evidence. And it's important that some fundamentals as to how you collect that data and information and how it's presented are followed. So things like, for example, authenticity. I kind of think about this, there's probably different definitions for this, but I kind of think about this in terms of quality. You want to make sure that you have high quality information. You want to make sure that the information that you collect is foundational or kind of sets the stage for what occurred, when did it occur, why did it occur, how did it occur, kind of all that foundation so that you can tell that story. And then making sure that what you're collecting is really relevant to the issue at hand, right? So you don't want to collect a lot of you can collect stuff that ultimately is unnecessary. You might not know it at the time, but I think certainly when you pull together your documentation or your report, you want to include that which was most relevant to the issue at hand. Okay, so the kind of subgroup that we're going to walk through here is listed. We'll walk through each one of these items, and again, I'm thinking in terms of what happens when you arrive on scene, and then how you can collect this data and information ultimately for what might be used in your enforcement. Okay, so for field safety, there are a number, as you all well know, there's a number of different types of hazards that you might come across when you're in the field. There are hazards that are associated with the types of facilities that you might ultimately go into or the property that you might go onto. There are different types of processes and process machinery. There's different types of structures, equipment, chemicals, constituents that you might come across. And so making sure that first and foremost, again, our first priority, your personal safety, making sure that you're protected and that you have the personal protective gear or PPE that you need to protect yourself. So eyes, skin, breathing, that type of thing. You want to make sure that you are protected when you actually go and conduct an investigation or respond to a complaint. One thing that I like to keep in here is this 8-hour first responder awareness training. To me, this seems like if you're going to do any sort of training, if you're really going out to a lot of different responses, this, in my mind, is a really good type of training. There might be others that Duke or Matt might recommend, but I think what it does is just gives you kind of a basic one-day fundamental course on that type of personal protection and what you might encounter and how you deal with that and how you look for those types of changing conditions without investing kind of in the 40-hour HAZWOPER type training. So is that something that you still, do staff still go to that sometimes, 8-hour responder?
Yeah, but most of our staff go through
the 40-hour.
Because if you're dealing with hazardous materials, people go for 40. But if you're just doing inspections and may encounter some hazardous substances, then 8 hours is enough.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a recommendation to the extent that you feel like it applies to you. Yeah, and again, it's just to make sure that you understand the basic types of information as to what you might be exposed to and how to deal with that and how to avoid it, because you want to minimize your risks. Okay, and then again, some of this is very basic, but just again, so we walk through all aspects. The general approach, so first and foremost, when a complaint comes in or an incident is called in, having the ability to investigate it as soon as possible is really important. For example, if this, puddle of who knows what, just stayed on the street for days, people might be walking through it, animals might be going into it, cars driving through it. So you want to make sure that this, is something that you can respond to fairly quickly. That's the 24/7 response. Having a general awareness of the potential hazards and what sources of information might help you figure that out. So again, if you come up on something and it's very clear where it came from, and there's people on scene, you might be able to figure that out quickly. Or you might just come across something you might come across a drum that's been abandoned. You don't know if it has material in it, or some sort of spill that's occurred. You don't know what the material is. So making sure that can you figure out the type of facility? Do you know what that facility has on site? Do you need to call fire out and have them, help make some sort of assessment of the material? So understanding those potential hazards and how to avoid them is important. And then avoiding exposure, isolating the area, denying entry, kind of with our little cartoon rendition here. Just making sure that people aren't driving through material, people aren't walking in it, because a lot of people just aren't paying attention to their environment. And you want to make sure if you know that somebody's called something in and it's potentially hazardous, you want to make sure you keep them away from it. And then likewise, why we're interested in personal safety and human health, again, thinking those first two tiers of priorities. The third priority, but also equally as important, is making sure that we're protective of both the storm drain infrastructure as well as the local receiving water bodies. And so again, to the extent that you can protect any of the drain inlets or catch basins that are around that immediate area, especially if they're downstream, just in case something comes off site, whether you protect that with a rubber mat or berm or sandbags or whatnot is important. Likewise, if something has already gone into a storm drain, you might have the ability, or at least think about how far down has that potentially traveled. Can we kind of go to that next manhole and actually have a chance to capture it? Has it already impacted the receiving water? Kind of understanding that flow path and what's happening or could happen, and protecting it as needed is something else that should also be in the thought process. And so that relates back to that personal safety, human health, that denying entry, protecting others, and then also containment and help protection of the environment. Okay, so there are a number of example types of lists and stuff that I'm going to bring up here and there, and these are available if you're interested. And so, for example, one of those is we talked about the authorized inspector and what tools or resources you might want kind of in your immediate person or on your vehicle to assist with responding. And so this is an example type of field kit or equipment list that you might have that helps kind of remind you and keep things stocked up so that when you go out, you can respond and be somewhat nimble to whatever you might come across, because there's a whole range of what you might see when you actually respond. So, and it has things all the way from gloves, cell phones, first aid kits, measuring tapes, duct tape, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of different types of supplies that may be very helpful. And again, this is the type of information and type of tools that the county keeps on their trucks when they're responding on your behalf. Okay? So that's kind of field safety, maybe field prep. And then we'll talk a little bit about record keeping. And again, this will be repeated throughout. But on record keeping, when I'm thinking about record keeping, I'm thinking about everything from the simple one-page form that might be filled out all the way to, a documentation of a full case that might go to the DA. So no matter what type of form or electronic interface or whatever you're completing to provide the information about the incident, there are some basic principles that you should follow when you're writing up some of that narrative. And some of these slides we took from another presentation, so we wanted to make sure we gave credit for those. But these are some really good principles. Making sure that the information in the narrative is organized so that it is understandable kind of on its own feet, and you're not referencing out necessarily to a lot of other documents. And that makes sense because over time, those linkages and those other documents may not be as clear as to what they were as they were when you wrote it. So making sure that everything's kind of self-contained is very helpful so that that case or that incident can kind of live on its own over the course of time. Making sure, and we'll touch on this a little bit more with the writing guidelines, making sure that when you're writing information out, that it's accurate, that it's really incredibly factual, who did what, when, where, how, and objective, and not biased by opinion. So-and-so was a jerk when he talked to me. You want to just, be very clear and objective with the narrative. And then, again, assessing the totality and credibility of the information provided. I think this is just making sure, again, that it's fully comprehensive, like we mentioned earlier, and that the information is credible and well documented. So those are some good principles to think about when you're writing up whatever it is you're writing up in whatever format. And then likewise, when you are writing that, some very precise types of guidelines include just making sure if you don't have time in the field, to write up your full narrative, which is completely understandable, making sure that your notes are good enough that you can translate them into that narrative when you're back in the office. I'm as guilty as anybody as taking notes like at a meeting, and then 2 or 3 days later you look at them and you're just like, I have no idea what I meant by, it made sense then, but making sure that the notes are really clear so that you can replicate that. And again, really some basics, proper grammar and complete sentences, all that good stuff. We talked a little bit this morning about active voice versus passive voice, things like, I saw or John saw versus it was observed. You should have I observed. And the reason for that is because if somebody observes something but you don't say who it was, years down the road when you're trying to figure out, well, who was the witness to that piece of this case is unclear. So making sure that those clear connections are made is very helpful. Really concise information. You don't want to overdo the information. And again, this is best professional judgment. But you do want detailed descriptions about what occurred so that somebody can understand fully, again, years down the road, what happened. Writing something in logical order, documenting the facts kind of from beginning to end so somebody can follow through. Obviously, jumping around could be very confusing, especially if somebody's not on scene. Avoiding the types of absolutes, always, never, all, just avoiding that's probably good. The other ones I think are appropriate, proper. Those are maybe somewhat subjective as to what's proper or appropriate. So those types of wording you can kind of avoid. And making sure you have conclusions, but where you have conclusions or statements of fact that they're backed up. So saying that, there obviously was a discharge that, exceeded objectives or that impacted the waterway. Having information backing that up would be important. Okay. And record keeping, again, this is a little bit duplicative, providing the accurate information. And I think that this information is important, irregardless of whether you're seeking cost recovery or you're going after enforcement. This is the basis of that action, and is what, if somebody challenges you, you can rely on to justify, why you did what you did, or why the certain mechanism was chosen for enforcement. This is also really important, as Matt said. Everyone breathes a little bit better on November 16th after the annual reporting is done. And this type of information is, to some extent, collected for the annual report. Obviously, not all of the detail of all of the incidents, but high-level types of information, numbers and enforcement actions and stuff. So having really good records helps with that process as well. And then the second to the last bullet, I think, again, recognizing that there's a variety of ways you might collect this information. It could be on a form, could be in a field notebook, it might be in some sort of electronic interface, but irregardless, all these principles still apply. And then retention policies really will depend, I think for enforcement actions, it's probably forever. I don't know if there's like a time that you would kind of clear out your records. But there may be internal policies for record keeping that you should think about for retention. I don't know. James is thinking that the county, for example, you just keep everything. Like there's no cleaning out of the records over time.
Yeah, we started doing that once our IT set a limit to what we can keep. But for investigations of pollution incidents, we try to keep as much as we can.
Yeah, right. Because they're a little bit different, right, versus emails and reports and that type of thing. Yeah. Especially because you might go back to them if you've got a chronic offender. Okay. And again, I'm not going to spend too much more time on this, but there's there's obvious types of information that you're going to record, and again, you could use a number of different interfaces for that. And then this, for example, is the electronic interface that the county uses when they enter in the information. And just recognizing that you all may have, I know over time, triplicate forms were used for a really long time, and then those evolved over time and included more fields and whatnot. That really, I think, some of those fields form the basis of this, but it's much cleaner now to be able to actually track things electronically in some fashion. There was a request today that James got that when a ticket is issued, I'm not sure if I'm using the right terms, but when there's something that comes up that you forward, that having a little bit more information about the case would be really helpful. So James logged that request this morning. Okay, so from the record keeping, reporting information, do you all have any questions about this? Yes, B. Yeah, no. Sure. Yeah.
Mobile detailer or someone there doing something in one city, maybe over, Lake Forest, and they come up to Cypress, so that's always really good for that continuation of ensuring they continue to repeat violating different cities. It's important to know that.
Exactly. And I think that there was a while where there were some particular mobile businesses that the inspection subcommittee was tracking as a whole for a while. This is a few years ago. But yeah, this is where then you can do a quick search of your records to see did ABC companies show up in multiple jurisdictions, and then you can collectively go after them. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Pontifications? Okay. All right. Fun group question number 6. I think we'll pick on my right side of the room. Which of the following are true statements? D as in dog? Any other opposing opinions? Yeah, I would say D as in dog. If there's a city-specific requirement to have a supervisor sign off, but as a principal, that's not a requirement. All right. So I just have a couple of quick slides about site entry because I just want to recognize that inspectors who go out and do proactive inspections deal with this all the time. But if you go out and you're responding to a complaint or incident and you've kind of nosed around in kind of what are the public areas, or we talked about this morning, even kind of the semi-quasi-public areas like parking lots where the public has easy access to those, and you decide or determine that you need to go kind of into the walls or fence line of a private property, and I'm talking more commercial industrial, not residential right now, that having consent for site entry is kind of an important component. And and this is based on my recollection of what we were told way back when by like the district attorney's office. But essentially is that you as an inspector need to obtain consent. So when you go up to the property, if you need to go in to kind of see what's going on, like you see something clearly running out of their back gate, for example, just explaining kind of why you're there, what you've observed, what you would like to do on site, that you might take notes. You'd like to be able to take some photographs to understand better what's going on. Most of the time, my experience has been, and I offer to see if you guys have the same experience, that most of the time people just want you out of their hair. They want to deal with the issue. They don't want to have any trouble. So they'll usually provide either explicit or implicit consent, meaning they'll either tell you, yes, come on in, please, oh my God, what's going on? Let's go figure this out. Or they'll just kind of wave you in, but not necessarily say the word yes. But those are both types of consent. And you've told them kind of full disclosure why you're there and what your intentions are, what you're wanting to do. But that consent is considered voluntary and can be revoked at any time while you're on the premises. And you shouldn't perform any sort of, kind of investigation or go on the property, like within the walls or fence line, if you don't have that permission. And if you are denied entry to the site, to the extent that you feel like your personal safety is not jeopardized, you can, collect the information and evidence at least of what you can from the public right-of-way or the publicly accessible areas. And then I would refer back to like your stormwater program manager, or your supervisor, whoever's the right line of command, to figure out, if really there's like, a lot of stuff coming off the site and you're like, this is ridiculous, we need to deal with this, but they're not letting you on, then that's when you can figure out, do you need to call law enforcement or have somebody else come out and help with this. But if you're given consent, then you can go ahead and go in and work with them on getting the additional information that you need. Any other thoughts on consent from anyone who's come across different issues? Yes. Get out. And then I would say you go back and you kind of figure out, is there something more that we need to pursue there? Do we need to get law enforcement out to kind of help us walk through it? My personal experiences was where people kind of faltered on an incident or a complaint. Once if fire was on scene, if fire came up with you, they quickly gave you permission. It was just, you carried a little more weight at that point. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know about airspace law. I don't know. Have you guys talked about that? And right, and you're in the public right away. Yeah.
I don't know what the law is for my drone. If it's, not over their airspace, I'm not sure. Private property, yeah. I mean, there's also just there's like parks, there's no drones, certain beaches, drones are banned. But as far as what we're talking about, Fourth Amendment stuff, I guess, I would use my professional judgment. I would just buzz my drone over the property.
I know. I think it's a good question. If you're at that level, you're probably talking with DA or attorney, I think, at that point. It's a good question for them. Yeah. And sorry, where? Oh, right, yeah. Right. Good point. Right. Really good question, though. So yeah, probably a little internal discussion about it.
I remember in code enforcement class, we did talk about if you're off their property, you want to take a picture, you can take pictures, but once you get a ladder or something, or go on the second floor of a building, then you're getting into some shady area where it's not going to look good for your investigation.
Warrant? Warrant, yeah. Right. Yeah, you had a question.
You brought that up with, they say, in the middle of your inspection, in the middle of it, they say, well, never mind, I don't want you to take away my consent. But you basically already took half the photos. You already have the photos. And normally they won't ask you to delete the photos. They just say, you know what,
Right.
So what if they say, I just thought of this when you said that. What if they say, oh, and I don't want you to delete the photos? What should you do?
Have you guys come across that? Yeah. Yeah. Consult with the city attorney? Yeah. Good question. I haven't experienced that. You all haven't experienced. Has anyone experienced that? Yeah.
Most of my time when I investigate in the middle, they say no.
Right.
I give them options. Since I'm here, I need to find out exactly what it is.
Right.
I'm here by myself now. If you don't allow, I can go back, report to my supervisor.
Right.
You might contact other agencies, the fire, the health department.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to be here.
Right. Encourage them to cooperate. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Right. No, I think that that's a good point. And that's what we used to say about photographs too, right? I would always tell them a photograph is going to be better for you because that conveys really good information, right? It's worth 1,000 words versus me trying to narratively explain what happened. It's going to be much better for you if there's pictures as well. So it's protective. So yeah, I think that that's good encouragement. Excellent. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you're not authorized. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good point. Okay, good. Really good discussion. Let's keep going. Okay, so the next three sections, so now we're going to assume we're on the site, so we were successful. So the next three sections, again, we're going to talk about these in terms of tools that are available and how you can approach it, scaling up or down as needed for the particular incident at hand. So for example, when we're talking about interviews, I'm really talking about everything from that simple exchange with the property owner or manager all the way up to a formal sit down with the DA with very specific questions lined out. So it could be anything in between. Obviously, the latter being far, I think I was only ever a part of 2 of those. So they're very rare. But these principles, again, apply to all of that range. And again, this information could be summarized on a standard type form or within the narrative of whatever you're writing or submitting. And one of the things about the discussions is that one of the things I think I was told, at least initially early on, is that you can get very different information from people depending on who you talk to first, second, third. And so, for example, if there's one of the guys in the back who's working in whatever portion of a facility, and then you've got the operations manager, kind of up front in the office. If they're both together, you're going to get only the manager kind of talking and being very careful about what's being said. You might get a lot more factual and honest information. Well, not honest, but maybe less filtered information from somebody who's kind of working more online. So just something to think about who you talk to when you talk to them. Talking to people separately is also very helpful. And again, it just depends on what the incident requires. But like the slide says, formal interviews, especially where you think something criminal may have transpired, really you want to, that's where it kind of gets out of our realm and more into you want law enforcement to be involved in that, or DA's office, et cetera. Okay. So and again, to the extent that you need to prep for this, just really depends on the setting and the need. But again, having a good rapport, being non-threatening, all that is just going to yield better conversation and better information back. To the extent that you have very specific questions, it's good to understand what those are, kind of lay those out first so that you can go through them. And similar to the narrative discussion, kind of going in some sort of logical order will help with people understanding what you're asking, kind of the flow of the information and how you write it up in the end. And then again, kind of explaining, why you need this information, what's the problem, why are you there, just like what we talked about with the site entry. And then this just kind of tees off of what we just talked about on the previous slide. So there's a number of different interview techniques that can be used when you're actually talking with folks and kind of trying to obtain information about what's transpired on a certain site. Things like, and we talked about some of these, making sure that you have kind of non-threatening topics and kind of tone and all that, maintaining control of the conversation, having proper, or good eye contact. One of the things that was said early on that reporters use as a technique is they will actually let silence be for a little while, because a lot of times people will feel the need to continue talking if there's silence versus constant talking. So that's another way that you might be able to get additional information that they might not have otherwise shared. And avoiding accusatory statements, the logical order, and then where you're not sure of something that's been said, asking those follow-up questions so you're not kind of filling in the blank is also helpful with the narrative and understanding kind of the full content of what's being said. And then this is kind of obvious, but kind of the poorly worded questions versus good questions. The bottom line is you want to have more open-ended questions, less kind of, yes, no is fine, but not like the leading types of questions where, you're asking it in such a way that it's really kind of obvious that there's probably one right answer. And so thinking about how the wording of those questions goes is important. And then also thinking about kind of the general to specific types of questions. Thinking about that non-threatening, what is really easy, basic information that can be answered so that you're kind of on a roll, early successes, and then you can get into more detailed information about like, who told you to rinse out that drum? Where did they tell you to dump it? How often do you dump it? You can start off with the easy stuff first and then work into some of that other information. This actually was based in part slightly by one incident that I responded to where they absolutely had a supervisor who had directed staff to rinse drums out that had, I can't remember what it was perchlorate or cyanide. It was something that was bad. It was chromium. It was chromium. Memory. And they were literally rinsing these drums out and dumping them down the curb and gutter line, several times a week or several times a month. So we actually kind of did, and talking to the people separately was really important to get that information. And this was elevated up. This was beyond a normal response. Do you have a question? Oh, sometimes we'll walk you over to like where things occurred or what hoses they used. Yeah. Oh, well, there was a response that we went out to, and then there was a lot of cleanup afterwards. Yeah, this was one that was elevated up. Yeah, this got out of our hands pretty quick. Okay. And then how you document the information. Again, whether you document this on like an official form or in some other manner, but just making sure you're very clear. Who did you talk to? When do you talk to them? What did they say? I think one of the other things, I'm not sure if this is still done, that I know we used to do is, even getting a driver's license, just to kind of make sure that you write down some factual information about them so you could find them later. So it's not like, yeah, I'm John Doe. You actually have a face and a name. Do you guys still collect that if you're talking with someone you need to?
We don't officially, but
yeah.
Some instances.
Yeah, or business card or some sort of identifying information. Yeah. Okay. And again, you apply that as needed based on the circumstance. It's obviously scaled. Okay, and then when taking photographs, very similar type of process. Again, you could have an official type of form you fill out or some sort of record keeping about the photos that you took. And in part, this is important because you can take a bunch of photos that seem to make sense, but when you get back in the field or if it's been a couple days since you looked at them, it can be really confusing, like, was this from the west side or the east side of the property? Was this upstream or downstream? It all starts looking kind of similar. So understanding kind of what you took, what was the perspective or vantage point is really good to document early on so that you're not trying to figure that out later, because I could never figure it out later. Like, it always started looking all the same to me, even though it made a ton of sense when we were there, and I thought it would be fine. And then making sure that both the narrative, both the informal kind of interviews or statements that you get from people and photos and samples, making sure that you integrate all that into your ultimate narrative or your report. So again, people understand kind of what was taken when and the timing of that, and understanding how all the different pieces fit together is very helpful. Yes.
Just kind of accidentally did what I did one time. Was telling you a sewer overflow is we always take a bunch of photos and then you go back to the office and we'll kind of piece it together with where was the photo taken, what is this?
Right.
Is you take video, right, where then and there, and then when you're looking at the video, all the pictures make sense, and then you have the video.
Yeah.
So video is not a bad thing, and we all have cameras that take video.
That's another really good point. Yeah, the use of video, right? Because it doesn't have to be individual still shots anymore. Yeah, that's actually a really, really good point. Thank you. Yeah, so in telling that story, whether it's through video, so very timely, whether it's through video or through still pictures or individual pictures, making sure that you kind of tell the full story and have that perspective and context of where the picture was taken. Again, it seems like somewhat obvious, but not always. So things like making sure that there's kind of that establishing location. You know, the box that held the thing that we were worried about was located here in the back of Mr. Brown's property, as seen, in this type of picture. And then you can kind of come up to it and then actually show, the offending thing or where the spill occurred. But it gives that context that you can provide. And also thinking about the context for the photo and making sure that you're making that connection to the facility or the impact to the environment is very helpful. And then also thinking about perspective. You might need to take again video or still pictures of kind of different vantage points so that it's very clear, for example, that yes, the drum was leaking. There was some particular notation, this X, let's pretend it's a label, that identified that this drum belonged to so-and-so, and look, it did leak into the soil and it contaminated the soil. We needed to clean it up. So it gives kind of all those vantage points so that you can show the connection throughout the story. And then likewise, whether it's interviews or photographs or samples, all the same types of principles. So for environmental samples, we touched on this earlier when we were talking about different types of resources that you might have available, either on a truck or having the ability to have some having the flexibility depending on what you come across in the field is important. And so understanding, first and foremost, what is it that you need to sample for? So having some sort of an idea, if you feel like a sample is needed, which it's not all the time for sure, but if you feel like a water quality sample is needed, understanding what are the chemical constituents you're after is the first question that you have. And if you're not sure of that, which is completely fair that you may not be in the beginning, you can talk to colleagues. You can also, or the county may be doing this, you can reach out to them. We also sometimes used to call our labs just to kind of brainstorm with them, like, here's kind of what we're dealing with. What would you recommend? What do we need to sample for? Because what you sample for dictates what bottles you use, the preservative, the handling techniques. It dictates all of that. So you need to kind of have a sense of that. So, and then once you do, you need to make sure you're using the bottles, preservatives, your sampling techniques, making sure you follow proper holding times, and making sure, again, while you're collecting the sample, that you're protecting yours, so use of gloves and whatnot. Plus, you don't want to contaminate the sample, so you want to maintain a very clean environment. And then chain of custody, which we'll come back to. And again, scalable depending on need. If you're taking samples, you don't always need to take 7 of them. You might only need 2 or 3, depending on what you're dealing with and the connection you might need to make. But some of the principles for the strategy that you might use when you're thinking about it. So in this case, the gray dot is where the discharge or spill occurred, and it has now gone off-site and traveled down the public right-of-way, which would be your street, Arsenic Avenue in this case. And so what you're going to want to do is if you have determined that samples are required or would be helpful, then what you want to do is start at your furthest downstream point and work your way back, because you're going to go from least contaminated to most contaminated. What you don't want to do is start at most contaminated and potentially disrupt something and then have that travel downstream, especially if it's like sediment. it's very difficult to take a sediment sample without disrupting it and having some float downstream if that's what you're dealing with. But kind of working to the most contaminated area, and then also making sure what is shown in item like number 1 is also understanding what the background is. If you get a test result back and it's 100, but background was 50, that gives you a sense of what was already in the environment per se. So understanding the background, you might also need to like sample the area of impact or that gray circle, because that actually makes that direct connection with what you're seeing in the environment. Again, all this is as needed depending on the situation and the circumstances you have, but this is one type of an approach. I would say this is probably your more full-bodied type of approach that's not always needed. Something that James brought up this morning was, for example, in Newport Bay, if somebody's pumping out their bilge, they literally might take 3 samples. One would be from the bilge, one would be from the immediate area of impact, and one much further away to get that background. And that's a very simple way to also achieve what's up here. And this actually is very helpful because you can actually see, depending on the situation, it was 100 on site, it was 40 in the street, it was 22 blocks down, it was 0 4 blocks down. I mean, you can see that type of impact as you go downstream. Not always, but in some cases you can.
One thing I know,
Yes.
this training is not really specific on it, but the sewer overflows that I mentioned with photos.
Yes.
I took the video. I think the reason I took it, I just remembered, is I wanted to make sure I captured the flow that was coming out of the sewer.
Yeah.
It's always hard when you grow, just estimating, trying to figure out how much actually came, how much was it 1,000 gallons or not, and then I can compare that and talk to my colleagues and say, what do you think this flow? The video will show that. And
Yeah.
depending on what time you're there, the flow's going to be bigger or smaller.
Right.
Or whatever it is discharging, you can capture how much flow is actually happening. So
Yeah.
just in case anybody hasn't figured that out, that's a good way to determine later on how much flow is actually coming out.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Has OCSD, they would do occasionally their sewer spill training, where they'd use their facility? Have they done that recently?
Yeah,
That's
they've
what made
done
me think of that.
They've done it recently for the sewer agencies.
Yeah,
And they'll do it on request, so we may think about doing that.
yeah, because they did kind of a similar type of thing where they went through a process of estimating and like how, whether it was like 4 holes or 3 holes on the manholes, cover, and then how high, to try to figure out some sort of volume. Yeah, good point. Thank you.
It's always like so difficult.
Yeah. When did it start? Yeah, right. Yeah.
1,000 gallons, like, do you have to report OES or what do we have to do?
Right. Yeah. What thresholds are you crossing over? Yeah. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So on sampling, again, we touched on it. This is a partial version of a table, and labs often have this type of table. But this is what we'll walk you through. Like if you know, for example, that you're sampling top row, I need to sample for gasoline. Then this will walk you through, what's the container you need, what's the volume, what's the preservative, et cetera, et cetera. So once you figure that out, you'll, you would want to know how do you collect the sample, what do you collect it in, and how do you transport it to the lab to make sure that it's a high quality sample that passes QA/QC. And again, this gets to the defensibility, because one of the first things that somebody will chip away at is, how something was collected, how it was handled, how it was stored. So making sure all those protocols are followed is pretty necessary. And then, like we also talked about with photos and interviews, I think that something like this is helpful, at least in some manner, whether it's on this type of form or not, making sure that you're very clear on what you took when, where was each sample collected, and just making simple note of that, because on the bottle itself, you're not going to put any sort of identifying information, because the lab needs to receive that, completely blind. They need to not know anything about the location of where it was collected. They just need, like, this is sample number 1A, 1B, very kind of basic, vague numbers, so that they have no bias when they're actually analyzing the sample. One thing that James brought up this morning, which I think is good to remember, is the one piece of information that will be communicated sometimes is if something is highly concentrated, so that it doesn't compromise their equipment when they're analyzing it. But that's not really giving identifying information. That's just telling them, look, this is super concentrated, so you may need to dilute it down or think about using a smaller volume so that it doesn't throw their equipment off. But keeping track of where you took things, because again, when you go and then fill out the chain of custody, this is where you're not going to put that type of information. It's going to be super factual, and you're just going to issue numbers and dates and numbers of containers. You're going to have very little description. And I think this is also in the county's local implementation plan. There's this form that kind of shows what information goes where. Again, I realize that not all of you may necessarily fill out chains of custody, but understanding kind of what type of additional information is needed and how they're handled, I think is helpful. And then if a city comes and provides a sample to the county that then is provided over to a lab for analysis, there's this type of form that can also be used to transfer information about that sample to the county when that is transferred to one of the labs for analyses. And so just recognizing that this is another piece of paper that can help supplement the information that's on the chain of custody, but give a little bit more context to the county. And anything, Duke or Matt, on this? Does that accurately kind of describe what the purpose of this is for?
Actually, we use it for harbor patrol.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
It's good for any transfer of samples from other agencies to us.
Perfect. Okay. So harbor patrol or others. Okay. And you won't always need to write up sampling results, but so at a very minimum level, you would have the results come back from the laboratory with the proper QA/QC. That at a minimum becomes a part of the project file. But if something starts to kind of elevate up in its severity, then it may be important to put those sampling results in context. And so occasionally there might be a need to actually write the sampling results up and indicate, for example, what was collected, where was it collected, how does that compare to standards, water quality standards, or known wildlife thresholds or other types of thresholds that exist out there, human health thresholds. So putting it into context is easier as a part of the case file, because that way it's clear, well, if something was 100, is that bad or good? And if it's bad, how bad is it? Kind of understanding that magnitude of what that means becomes helpful. So that might be something that's done, again, if the severity increases with a particular incident. Questions? Okay. Second to last fun group question, number 7. Where did we go last time? Is it you guys now? We'll just say it's you guys now. So question number 7, which of the following statements is false? Somebody said D? Yeah, and I would say D, because statement A is true. You definitely need permission and consent. So D. So D is in dog. So B and C are false. Okay. Okay. Records review. I think I literally only have one slide on this. I do. And this is just, all I want to do is recognize that if it becomes obvious, for example, that you may have a facility that's, kind of chronically having problems, or you're needing to find out additional information about what's going on at a facility, especially if it's a facility like an industrial location that has to be covered under the industrial general permit, they're going to have a lot of additional information that may help you understand, kind of what's going on site and what their protocols are, because they'll have things like annual reports, monitoring reports, stormwater pollution prevention plans. They'll have this other extraneous information that might also give you what you need for what you're working on. You might also, code enforcement also has a lot of really good information about, the different facilities that they go out to and visit. So just being aware that there are other types of records that may help supplement what you need, again, if something kind of starts to increase in its severity. That's really the only point I wanted to make on this. And then enforcement and reporting, and we are nearing the end here. So we talked a little bit about the different types of mechanisms. And so one of the types of mechanisms that I personally feel like is very useful is cost recovery. And so if your city doesn't currently use cost recovery as one of the options, I think it is useful because depending on the type of incident, there can be a lot of staff time that's involved in actually responding to, especially if you have to go out multiple days, if you have your public works crew come out, if they have to use the equipment to help clean something up, if you have a contract cleanup company that comes out, passing that cost on. And I'm talking not necessarily residents as much as I am like kind of commercial industrial types of facilities, people who are, in the business of making a profit on what they're doing. That can be very helpful and can get their attention. You may or may not choose to use that in addition to enforcement or use that as part of your kind of enforcement toolbox. But it is very helpful to, especially in the rising cost of the stormwater program, anywhere where you can kind of recoup some of your fees is helpful. And then outside of that, there are a range in the Enforcement Consistency Guide and Enforcement Response Plans. They identify a whole range of different types of both administrative and criminal-based actions that you can use or mechanisms for enforcement. And this is actually a graphic that I actually really like this graphic over time. This has stayed in my kit over time because I think what it does is it just really shows that there is a lot of professional judgment in what type of enforcement mechanism you choose to use, and it really should be based on a whole, like several different types of factors, and those are laid out here on the left-hand side, where it talks about, threat level, environmental harm, event duration, frequency, et cetera. Thinking about all of those types of, where did this incident land on all these different, with all these different criteria, may help you kind of figure out, is this something that's really more in the realm of, kind of a lesser type of action, or are we really on the criminal side? So thinking about that type of structure, and I'm sure that's contained within the enforcement response plan. I haven't read that in detail, but understanding that you have that ability and how you can make those choices, I think, is helpful. Because I remember, especially when I was new, I would come back and I'd be like, I don't know. I mean, how do you decide that? So having some sort of a guide felt like, oh, okay, I have some criteria. I can apply these. It made it less of a dark hole for me. And then this is an example of one of the forms that the county uses. But again, you can, depending on once you've made that selection, then you may have a certain type of form that you can fill out and then hand to the responsible party, so that they're very clear on what happened, when it happened, what section of code, that's kind of the middle portion, what was the exact section of code that was violated with what occurred, and then if there are follow-up actions and timeframes, what those are. So there's very clear communication. So if they then don't do what you've kind of instructed them to do and or what they agreed to, you can come back and kind of follow up on that because there was very clear communication made and you have that documented. And when things, ramp up, they may go all the way from, the form, where you might communicate some sort of enforcement through this form, all the way to possibly working with the district attorney in developing a case report. And we actually worked many years ago on, it's very similar to what's used today on a template for a case report. So if a case is pursued, what are all the different types of information that need to be included? And we have that all laid out in this is kind of template, if you will. And then recognizing that as that is filled out, bringing this all back home, there's a whole number of different types of exhibits that can then be attached and incorporated into the narrative of this report. And things like what we just talked about, what are the written records or reports, what is that narrative, what were enforcement actions that were taken, photos, samples, maps, historical paperwork or records that you can pull from. All that, everything that we just talked through can be bundled up as a part of that case template if that in fact moves forward. Like when it all comes back to the case. All right, our very last question. I know you guys are sad. Which of the following can be used as a part of an enforcement framework? Yeah, E, all of the above, right? So you have a whole bunch of tools that are available to you that can be used. And thank you guys for playing. It just breaks it up just a little bit. Okay, very last section, and this is really brief. I want to leave you not only understanding that there's this core competencies table that you can use to kind of reference, what might be a part of your responsibilities and how you can bolster those, but also the resources that are available to you if you want to dive into anything that we touched on today, because today really the purpose is to be very introductory, kind of 101, touch on a whole bunch of subjects, but each one of those is really its own training module. I mean, each one has been developed into training modules over time. And in fact, I refer to the wonderful emails that Matt puts out regarding the inspection subcommittee and kind of highlighting all the different types of trainings and opportunities that are offered through that subcommittee. If you're not a part of that subcommittee, it's a fantastic resource for you to plug into. I would encourage you to do so, especially just the whole range. I mean, you can see everything from fire suppression, food service establishments, how you can do reporting, all sorts of subjects are talked about there. So that is a wonderful resource for you. I would say probably if you're going to prioritize, to me it seems like probably the most important one. And then likewise, and that's at the top of our bullet list here, likewise the Orange County DA Strike Force, which is still monthly. Those are, I recognize not everyone's going to have time to go to a bunch of meetings, but those are also good to plug into every once in a while if you have a chance. I'm assuming those are still public. Are they public? The Strike Force? Well, but agency like, sorry, what I mean by that is like authorized inspectors could go. Yeah, okay, that's what I'm meaning. Yeah, not just like Joe Blow, yeah. Okay, and those are still monthly? Perfect.
Third Wednesday, usually at the Brian National District.
Oh, good. It's a good place to meet. So there's the quarterly inspection subcommittees, the strike force, which is monthly, third Wednesdays. And then there's a whole list of additional external types of trainings that are really good. Again, if you're looking to kind of dive into some certain areas, there's a whole bunch of resources available to you to do that. Yes.
I've attended the Basic Inspectors Academy and the last one, the Environmental Crimes Training. So if you have any questions on those, contact me. I thought they were worth my time, and they should be worth your time as well.
Yeah.
I think they're both 3 days, actually. So, and if you're in love with any of this, there's a 2-week course. Which the environmental crimes training, you take a 3-day prerequisite, and then there's a 2-week intensive advanced master's class in.
Wow.
Crimes enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah. It's.
1 day, 2 weeks, it's big time. So,
Yeah.
Career development. Maybe if either your agency or you yourself personally, you have like a political lead towards this. There are training options for you to take to the next level.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah, no, so Matt's a really good resource, yeah, having attended a few of those. And Duke, certainly you've attended a lot over the years, too. Especially is it CHMIA? You used to go to those quite often. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, CHMIA is for all California regulatory and enforcement agencies, and they discuss all the different cases that have gone through the system, investigations that have gone through all the methodologies for enforcement and investigations. So very, very good training.
Yeah, good.
And
Yeah.
it's usually held at Shell Beach. Nice.
Yeah, right. Excellent, thank you. I was going to name, it's not at, and I couldn't think of an area, I don't want to offend anybody. Okay, so lots of training resources available to you. And again, just circling all the way back to the very beginning when we talked about different types of key documents. And again, this is in the training program framework. Just be aware of those. Plug in as needed. And before you leave, we are at the end, and I really, truly am committed to the 4 o'clock time frame for you. So what I'd like to do is I'd like you to, if you can, fill out 2 forms for me. One is a general evaluation about today, and the other is our post survey. So if you could fill both of those out, as soon as you're done, bring them up here, and then you're free to go. And then, Matt, can you help me hand those out? So they'll be